Welcome to this special edition of Hannity, the Trump Doctrine. I'm Judge Jeanine Pirro, in for Sean tonight. President Trump continues to warn Pyongyang as Kim Jong-un makes new threats. Ed Henry is at the White House tonight with more. Ed?
Judge, the third straight day where we heard President Trump deliver strong rhetoric about North Korea, but what was really new today was that he and his top aides balanced all of that with efforts to work the diplomatic side, the president talking about bringing peace. So his critics continue to say that he's warmongering, but the president himself actually held talks with his two top diplomats, the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and the U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, to highlight he's also trying to defuse this, even as the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un warned he's preparing a missile launch aimed at the U.S. territory Guam, and he also warned that the U.S. mainland could suffer a, quote, shameful defeat and final doom if it persists in the extreme military venture, sanctions, and pressure. Now, for the president, in addition to an early morning tweet in which he declared the U.S. military is locked and loaded just in case, he added this.
I think South Korea is very happy, and you don't mention Japan, but I think Japan is very happy with the job we're doing. I think they're very impressed with the job we're doing, and let's see how it turns out. I feel that they will be very safe. Believe me, they will be very safe. And if anything happens to Guam, there's going to be big, big trouble in North Korea.
Now, the Associated Press revealed, meanwhile, that a senior U.S. diplomat has been having conversations with North Korean counterparts. Yet another sign that the Trump administration quietly is trying to calm this down. Judge?
Ed Henry, thank you. Joining us now with reaction is Fox News contributor and former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton. All right, good evening, Ambassador. It seems that we've never been closer to the brink of a nuclear war than we are right now. Is that a correct statement?
Well, I think we're at a crisis point, undoubtedly, because of the progress that North Korea has made on its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs, particularly in the last 8 years. So Donald Trump inherits really 25 years of a failed policy of trying to negotiate North Korea out of these programs, and his options are few and not very good.
You know what's interesting, Ambassador, is the fact that the president, and he's been criticized for his rhetoric, but the president is making it very clear that he is prepared and ready, locked and loaded, to defend the American people and our territories as well. What's wrong with that?
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. You know, we've had 25 years of American politicians, Democrats and Republicans, standing up and saying solemnly, it is unacceptable for North Korea to have nuclear weapons. Same thing for Iran. Well, now we're being told by the same people who said we could negotiate North Korea out of these weapons, say basically, you know, I guess we've got to accept that that they're going to have nuclear weapons. Susan Rice wrote about it in the New York Times this morning on television. She said, I guess our policies failed. And now they're telling us we do have to accept it. I think that's not where Trump is, and that's not where we should be as a people. We should not allow ourselves to be held hostages by this erratic regime and the threat of nuclear terrorism against our country.
You know, without looking backward for too long, I mean, do you see the way that some of the administrations, particularly the Clinton administration, giving money to North Korea, and then the parallel of the Obama administration giving money to Iran? I mean, do you see that the appeasement that seems to be going on is only to our detriment, and that it is time for us to stand up, because these bullies are at the point where the Iranians yell death to America, death to the big devil, the little devil, Israel and the United States? I mean, what are we supposed to do, turn around and put our tail behind our legs?
Yeah, no, look, I think the legacy of policies over the past 25 years has been appeasement, and it's not the first time it's been called appeasement. Former Secretary of State Jim Baker, right after the Clinton administration signed the agreed framework, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that called the Clinton administration policy appeasement. That was 20 years ago. It hasn't worked. So unless you want to have a future where North Korea can threaten the United States with nuclear-tipped missiles, you have to look either at one more diplomatic play to convince China to reunite the peninsula with us in a constructive way and eliminate North Korea, or you have to look at the military option. People are worried about the difficulty, the chaos that might create today. The risk is real. What about the chaos when North Korea launches missiles at the United States?
Well, it's almost as though, and by the way, Kim Jong-un is putting a time period on it by the middle of August. But what's interesting is it's come out that there are back-channel negotiations that began with Otto Warmbier, the American university student who was sent home in a coma and died shortly thereafter, and Tillerson saying, that we will always consider negotiation, even at the point that we're at right now. What option does America have right now?
Well, there is no option to negotiate with North Korea. We've tried it for 25 years. It failed. Just cite, for those who believe in it, cite one piece of evidence to think it will succeed in year 26. I think that's why the president's inherited such an unhappy situation. I do think it's worth trying with China on an expedited basis to convince them it's in China's national interest
How do we do that,
North Korea.
How do we convince China? I mean, the president has done everything, privately and publicly, and China says, hey, look, if America strikes first, and there's a whole issue as to whether or not that makes us the aggressor if we're trying to defend ourselves, then the question is, I mean, China says they're going to fight with North Korea against us.
Well, they also said that if we were retaliating against North Korea, they would stand aside, and that's a significant development. I think there's a chunk of Chinese decision makers who think North Korea is a pretty ugly piece of baggage. I think there's a deal that can satisfy China on reunification. It's a hard argument. I wish we had started it 10 years ago, but better late than never, because otherwise the American people have a choice. Live with a nuclear North Korea and the threats and nuclear bribery that will entail forever, or do what the politicians said. Do not accept a nuclear North Korea. That could well involve a military option of some sort.
All right, Ambassador John Bolton, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, and here now with more reaction is the host of War Stories, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. All right, good evening, Colonel. Here's my question. I mean, the last question that I asked the ambassador, I mean, what does America do now? I mean, on the one hand, we've got Tillerson saying we're still willing to negotiate. We hear today that there are back channels, and yet we've got the president saying, hey, we're locked and loaded, and we're ready to defend this country and our territories.
Well, look, I agree completely with what John just said in terms of convincing President Xi and the People's Republic of China that it's in their interest to act now. Because unless Xi intervenes to stop Kim Jong-un, the United States is going to have to take preemptive military action against the regime in Pyongyang. And that's going to have catastrophic consequences, not just for North Korea, but for the People's Republic of China. Consider this, Judge. Up to 20% of the North Korean population, 25 million human beings, is likely to flee on foot across the Yalu and Tumen rivers and take to the sea like boat people from Vietnam. That is a disaster of extraordinary proportions for China. There are things the president needs to do in the time that we've got to convince Xi that we are deadly serious, because talking to Kim Jong-un is a waste of time.
It is a waste of time, but here's the thing. It's not as though the president hasn't explained to President Xi in China that, look, you're going to suffer and you're going to have a mass migration from the peninsula.
But see, I don't think Xi is necessarily confident at this point that we are going to take action. And what has to be done, there's a bunch of things that could be done. For example, return the tactical nukes to the Republic of Korea that we withdrew back in the 1990s. We can deploy another carrier strike group to the region. We've got the Reagan going back into port to rearm and give the guys a couple of days.
When is that going to be deployed?
Well, she's in a port in Japan. She can be back along the Korean coast and close enough to strike with air assets and all the rest of it. If we move some aircraft and more air tankers to Guam and Okinawa, these are clear signals to the Chinese that we are getting ready to act. How about this? Deploy search and rescue assets, and even ask Xi if we can base some of those search and rescue assets in China to recover our air crews, some of which will get shot down.
But if, as you say, Colonel, hold on. But if, as you say, we take preemptive action and we strike first, China has said that they will, if that occurs, that they will take the side of North Korea.
Well, but this is again what my point. We are going to have to do this. We're facing a clear and present danger, an existential threat from the crazy regime in Pyongyang. We face the same problem ultimately from Tehran. Now, we could, for example, just to make sure everybody understands we're serious, deploy the U.S. naval ship Mercy, the hospital ship from San Diego, to Busan, Korea. It sends a big signal. It's very visible. Deploy more U.S. Marine and Navy assets out to the region. Deploy more intelligence satellites and reconnaissance to update our target list. And that's going to leak here in this town. You know that. You can deliver biological and chemical protection equipment to the Republic of Korea. And finally, you could urge Japanese Prime Minister Abe to go to Beijing and tell the PRC President Xi, you'll go down in history as the man who talked us back from the brink. You'll get all the credit if you take Kim Jong-un back down.
All right.
All of those things have to be done before you start military action.
Even though there was a unanimous vote of the UN Security Council,
yes,
I mean, that didn't seem to have any impact. Unanimous, Russia and China.
But that's because they're not seeing in Beijing, forget Pyongyang, they're not seeing in Beijing that we're deadly serious. And we are. And there has to be. Because what's going to happen otherwise, a military operation is going to use sea and air assets, cruise missiles, and Air Force strike aircraft to literally decapitate the regime in Pyongyang. Take down their air defenses, their C-cube comms with cyber attacks and special weapons strikes that we can't talk about on TV. And if Kim survives all that, he's going to have to issue orders to launch things with carrier pigeons because they won't be able to talk to each other.
Let me ask you one quick question. I only have a few seconds left. Seoul, South Korea. Everybody knows, you know, if they strike us or if we strike them, then they're going to strike South Korea. Why are they resistant to the THAAD defense missile system?
Well,
don't they know what's going on?
Well, because again, nobody thinks we're serious. Because just as Ambassador Bolton said, for so many times there's been so much bluff and bluster. This is not a president that anybody ought to take anything but deadly serious.
Couldn't agree with you more. Colonel Oliver North. And a quick programming note, be sure to catch Colonel North on War Stories tomorrow at 8 p.m. on the Fox Business Network. And coming up on this special edition of Hannity, retired Brigadier General Tony Tata and Rick Grinnell react to the growing threat from North Korea. Stay with us.
Live from America's News Headquarters, I'm Marianne Rafferty. President Donald Trump says he's considering possible military action against Venezuela. President Trump has been critical of President Nicolas Maduro and his move to consolidate government power, calling him a dictator. And violence has claimed the lives of more than 100 people in Venezuela as the political crisis spins out of control. President Trump says he's not going to rule out a military option, but so far the U.S. has only issued a series of sanctions against Maduro and more than 24 Venezuelan officials. And the U.S. Marine Corps has ordered all its aircraft grounded for a 24-hour period following 2 deadly crashes. The move affects 1,000 aircraft in total, including those currently deployed. It's up to unit commanders to choose which day during the next 2 weeks to ground their planes. I'm Marianne Rafferty. Now back to Hannity.
That they are going to fully understand the gravity of what I said. And what I said is what I mean. Well, we don't want to talk about progress. We don't want to talk about back channels. We want to talk about a country that has misbehaved for many, many years, decades actually, through numerous administrations, and they didn't want to take on the issue, and I have no choice but to take it on. If he does anything with respect to Guam or any place else that's an American territory or an American ally, he will truly regret it, and he will regret it fast.
Welcome back to this special edition of Hannity. The Trump doctrine that was President Trump with more stern words for North Korea's dictator Kim Jong-un. So how should the U.S. respond to the latest threat from North Korea? Joining us now is former spokesman for the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Rick Grinnell, and the author of Besiege, retired Brigadier General Tony Tata. All right, good evening, gentlemen. I'm going to start with you, Rick. I mean, you worked in the State Department. You have been involved in the communications, and I'm sure you've been watching the verbal back and forth, the volleys that have been going back and forth. Kim Jong-un has given us almost a deadline. He said specifically the middle of August. In the last month, he's launched 2 ICBMs. We know that he's got the miniaturized nuclear warheads. We know that he is boasting that he's going to, turn us into jelly. Now, people are critical of the president. What should the president be saying? Okay? Or just back off the way Obama did and hope it goes away?
Yeah, look, and one more scary thing, they successfully put a rocket into orbit. So they're getting all the pieces here, and I think we've got to see the signs and take it very seriously. I agree with my old boss, John Bolton, that the play here is not with North Korea, it's really with China. And one interesting thing, Judge, is that the Chinese removed oil sanctions from this last round of UN sanctions. By them removing the oil sanctions, that means that they think that we still have time, which goes to Colonel North's point that they're not taking us seriously. And what they need to understand is that this is not President Obama just with a threat of military action, but this is President Trump with a credible threat of military action. For diplomats, we need that credible threat behind us so that when we're sitting across the table and we're negotiating, the other side knows we need to come to a peaceful deal, because if not, we have to transfer the file back to the Pentagon, and General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, they don't negotiate.
Yeah, I could see that. And I'll ask you this, General Tata. When the president made it clear that he wasn't, he wasn't going to be soft on this, we also showed our military mechanisms. I mean, we also showed the planes, and we also talked about the aircraft carriers. I mean, the president is putting, the power behind the words. Is that enough?
Well, I think what you're seeing, Judge, is the application of all of the elements of national power working in synchronization and harmony, something the Obama administration was particularly incompetent at. And I agree with everything Rick says. We've got a real perception gap to overcome here, because President Obama so anethicized the entire nation and the world by submitting to our enemies and actually giving billions of dollars to Iran and other countries. And now when President Trump, who says what he means, it's like a stark difference out there. And so people are waking up, but it takes them a little bit of time to say, does an American president really mean what he says? Mm-hmm. And I believe that President Trump is using the information aspect of national power in a very effective way. He's saying something that's very clear. You've got Secretary Tillerson saying something that's diplomatic, but supporting what President Trump says. And Secretary Mattis is saying something that's very direct, but supporting what President Trump says. So all of that is aimed at supporting the military, the flexible return options that we've got going. There's the UN sanctions. That's part of diplomatic power and the economic power with the economic sanctions. So all of that combines and synchronizes to create pressure on North Korea and on China.
All right, let me ask you this, Rick. This is a big weekend, I think. If nothing happens this weekend, I think a lot of people are very concerned. If things seem to tap down, in light of the fact that there seems to be a back channel that the Secretary Tillerson is still, working on, that if we can get past this weekend, are things okay? That's number one. And number two, is a preemptive strike possible?
Look, I think things are going to be okay when we see China move. I would give China a very short window. I'd give them 1 week to shut down all of the trade. We have to remember, judges, that in the first quarter of this year, the Chinese increased trade with North Korea. They didn't get the message. They're increasing their trade.
Right.
So we need to see in the next week a shutdown. If not, I would suggest we got one more play with China, which is unilateral U.S. banking sanctions. It's not without pain. It's a painful act for Americans, for Wall Street. But I think that we immediately go to that within 1 week if we haven't seen action from China.
Preemptive strike, General? Is that what should be done? Or do we wait for him to hit us or our territory, Guam?
A preemptive strike could result, they've got 8,500 artillery pieces, 4,500 rocket launchers right along the DMZ there that can range 30, 40, 50 miles, and that puts Seoul into play.
Yeah, but Seoul didn't want to accept the missile defense system, the THAAD missile defense system that we offered them.
Well, THAAD would do nothing against all of these artillery shells that would come raining across the border.
But you would think they would want anything.
Yeah, you would think, but my point, Judge, is that there's a doctrine of a golden bridge. You increase the pressure, you lay out all your elements of power, you show what can be done, you make your intent very clear, and you leave that golden bridge for KJU to walk across into the land of diplomacy and to stand down. Or you ultimately get into a conflict that the conventional aspect of this conflict is almost scarier than the nuclear aspect of this conflict.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. And coming up next on this special edition of Hannity, the Trump Doctrine. Herman Cain will be here with reaction to President Trump telling Senate Majority Leader McConnell and the Republicans.
What happened, in my opinion, last week is unacceptable. People have been talking about repeal and replace for 7 years, long before I ever decided to be doing what I'm doing. 7 years they've been talking repeal and replace, and it didn't happen. And not only didn't happen, it was a surprise. And it was a horrible surprise. And it was very unfair to the Republican Party and very unfair to the people of this country.
Welcome back to this special edition of Hannity, the Trump Doctrine. President Trump continues to put pressure on Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to enact his agenda. Joining us now with reaction is Fox News contributor and former presidential candidate Herman Cain. Good evening, Herman.
Hello, Judge Pirro. Happy to be with you.
It's good to have you. You know, when you listen to the president, I have a sense that probably the vast majority of American people, Democrat and Republican, are probably saying, what's with these bozos? After 7 years, they couldn't get done what they promised they'd get done, some of them even switching when the time mattered.
You're absolutely right. And the biggest, to use your word, bozo, is Senator John McCain. I'm sorry. I respect him for his military service, but I do not respect him for stabbing the American people in the back. And as far as Mitch McConnell, who is supposed to be the majority leader in the Senate, if he couldn't get Senator John McCain to be that deciding vote so we could at least take a major step forward, then yes, there is a problem. Senator McCain is not the majority leader, and he consistently shows that he resents President Donald Trump.
Well, I don't think there's any question about that. We've seen it over and over. But, you know, doesn't this explain, Herman, the fact that the majority of American people, I think it was 16%, and now it may be down to 10% of American people, approve the job that Congress is doing. So who are these guys and the women, who are they trying to satisfy? Themselves, their reelection, or the American people?
They are trying to satisfy their own egos. The longer they are in Washington, D.C., Senator Susan Collins, Senator Lisa Murkowski, Senator John McCain, the more they drink the water and believe it's about them and not about the American people. Look, the American people are suffering under Obamacare, and they have demonstrated that they care more about their rules and care more about their own egos than they care about the suffering of the American people. And I respect President Trump for continuing to keep the pressure on, because the American people are sick and tired of excuses, and that's all Senator McConnell and the other senators are offering.
Didn't you think it was very unusual for Mitch McConnell to go back to his own district at a Rotary Club? I don't know if he thought nobody would hear him, but when he talked about this president and unrealistic expectations, did he not realize that by criticizing the president that we elected because he was an outsider, because we believed he'd get the job done, that these bozos can't get done? Did he really think the president wouldn't hear it? And does he think that we're stupid? There's 10% of the American people think they're doing a good job.
Yes, he thinks we're stupid. Excessive expectations, they are not excessive because the American people do not believe it's excessive. One of the reasons, of the reasons that President Trump got elected is because the American people have high expectations. But what Senator McConnell was saying was, this president needs to understand that we move at a snail's pace. No, this president and the American people are sick and tired of the snail's pace. I don't know if he believed that President Trump and the American people are going to hear it or not, but we have now heard it, and that's why many of us have already said what we've been saying all along. His leadership, Senator McConnell, his leadership is ineffective.
Well, okay, let's talk about Murkowski. She in particular I'm fuming with because she voted to repeal in 2015. She campaigned on it, and then she turned around when we had a chance to do it, and she voted no, even on the skinny repeal. Senators like that, I believe, need to be defeated. But the overarching question is this the Republican establishment? And who is more establishment than Mitch McConnell? And everybody's giving him credit for Gorsuch. Well, you know, Gorsuch is the best thing that's happened to the Supreme Court in a long time. But isn't it time, or isn't this an indication that the establishment is out to finish Donald Trump?
Yes, you have two types of Republicans. You have Republicans who are trying to pass legislation that reflects conservative values, and you have what I call rhinos, Republicans in name only. And Senator Murkowski and Senator Collins and Senator John McCain represent three senators that are rhinos. They are not there to represent the interests of the American people, and the American people have figured that out. I'm not sure what they claim their reason is for voting against the skinny repeal. And look, we know it wasn't as big and grand as many of us would have liked, but at least it would have been a big step in the right direction following what the House of Representatives had done. They basically failed the American people, and they stabbed the American people in the back because you didn't expect any Democrats to vote for it, and they didn't. So they are perfectly happy with a disastrous Obamacare.
Well, you know what? The shame of it is it makes the whole party look bad, and these rhinos, I think, they have to go. Anyway, thank you so much, Herman Cain. And coming up next on this special edition of Hannity, President Trump is not shy about responding to attacks from the liberal mainstream media and calling out fake news. Greg Jarrett, a new RNC spokesperson.